Hi, this is Tom Kemp, CEO at Centrify Corporation here, and welcome to another one of our video Chalk Talks. Today we're going to focus on smart cards, specifically Centrify's Mac smart card support, and this is part one of a two-part series. In part one, I'm joined with David McNeely, our Director of Product Management, and he's going to talk about the principles behind using and leveraging Mac smart cards and how we actually support smart cards in a Mac environment. And in part two, David and our CTO, Paul Moore, will go into the deep details of the product architecture behind our smart card support for the Mac environment. So, let's talk about smart cards. So, at a high level, what is a smart card?
So basically a smart card is it's an authentication device, and the easiest way to think about it is that it's a self-contained computer that it's in the form factor of a card. You insert it into a card reader, and it only knows the PIN or the password, if you will, for a single user. And the reason it's used is because in order to authenticate, the main purpose behind this is to ensure that the correct person is the one that's logging onto the computer. With a password, I can tell you the password and then you could go log onto my account. And in higher security environments, they want to make sure that it's the proper person logging into the system. So therefore, we use a thing that I hold and something that I know, and in that case, the card.
Okay, so people want smart card support for higher levels of security.
Absolutely. So if you think about, we tie all these computers into Active Directory and enable a single user ID password to authenticate the user into the whole entire infrastructure, and that lets me gain access to everything. So that being the case, a lot of customers want to be able to secure that even further. So they make sure that if it really is you that's logging on, and I'm going to give you access to everything, I want to make sure that that it's the correct person. And further, there's another interesting thing that smart cards enable, and we find a lot of customers combining the smart card, since it is in the credit card form factor, with a building access card, so that if I leave my office and I know that I'm going to go through a door that requires my building access card, that I'm taking my card with me. The event of pulling it out of the card reader causes my machine to lock, which means that we're reducing risk for somebody just walking into my office and trying to do something as if they were me.
Okay, and so Centrify, we now support the smart card on the Mac environment. So can you talk a little bit more about our support for Mac smart cards?
Right. So one of the things that we had to do, our DirectControl product enables the Macintosh to authenticate to Active Directory with a user ID password. So in Active Directory, there's the ability to go into a user account and select an option that says smart card login required for interactive logins. And a lot of those people that want to set up that higher level of security want to be able to turn on that checkbox. But in the past, if you'd had a Macintosh, you wouldn't be able to turn that checkbox on because it would prevent the user from logging on with his user ID and password. And so what we've done is to augment the DirectControl product and enable it to perform this PKI-based authentication to Active Directory using the smart card. Meaning I insert the card in, over the wire we're doing a PKI validation operation back to the domain controller to prove that it's the correct user in front of the machine trying to log in.
Is this the same card that people could use on a Windows system? So is that part of the benefit? It's the smart card that they can use for a Windows desktop can now also be used with basically the same capability in the Mac environment.
Right. In a lot of these cases, let's say in the federal government's case, they call it a common access card in the military agencies. And in that environment, it is a card that performs both photo ID functions as well as building access and computer access, and designed to be used for all computers. But you need the software that we provide in order to tie into Active Directory, and that was sort of the missing piece. They've been able to use smart cards for, let's say, using it on the browser for PKI-based authentication to websites and special applications like email, but what was missing was that login to Active Directory that sort of ties it all together.
Okay, so you mentioned the CAC card. What other smart cards does Centrify support in the Mac environment?
Basically, at the simplest level, we support any card that has a token D driver, and that's technology we'll talk about in the second half of this with Paul Moore. But basically that means that if there's a driver for the card itself, and it's not only the physical card and the piece of plastic, but also the way that it was formatted and how it was provisioned, if you will. So we support the CAC card and the PIV card, and those are based on the fact that Apple provides a driver that supports those. And we've also done some testing with some other third parties like Gemalto's .NET card, and that works as well. We find customers like Microsoft and a few other organizations that use those .NET cards as the method to authenticate.
Okay, so, and how does this differ from what Apple itself provides with the Mac? What's the value add that we offer? Obviously, our viewers clearly know that we provide very robust cross-platform authentication, the single sign-on across Unix, Linux, and the Mac. We obviously provide the group policy support for the Macs, and by the way, we have another video chalk talk on Mac group policies performing desktop lockdown in Macs. So that's the value add from an authentication as well as from a group policy. But what's the value add of what we offer as it relates to Mac smart card support vis-a-vis what you get with Apple?
Right, so what Apple has provided is a lot of the base foundation framework for the security functions itself on the machine so that I could use a smart card to authenticate to the computer itself. But that means that they support, insert the card and it'll change the dialog box from user ID and password to, it'll say my name and it'll have a place for a pin to be displayed. And that would let me log onto the computer by itself. The problem is that there's a lot of other things that need to take place in order to authenticate to Active Directory over the wire. Given that normally with an Active Directory authentication, we need the user's password and encrypt a piece of data that gets sent to the domain controller to validate that it really is me that's logging on. In the PKI world with a smart card, what ends up happening is that same piece of data gets encrypted with a key that's on my card and sent over to a domain controller to be decrypted, prove that it was me that logged on, and then create a ticket granting ticket to send back. And so what Apple missed was that piece of it, which in the key, what people really wanted is that ticket granting ticket, because that sets up Kerberos and enables single sign-on to other Windows integrated services.
So it's the additional Active Directory and the corresponding Kerberos capabilities that you don't get out of the box, so to speak.
Right, right. Let's say that if I've got a Macintosh, I want to be able to authenticate to the Windows file servers, print servers, to get to my Exchange mailbox, a lot of those kind of things, and they're all Kerberized. But in order for that to work, if I were to use Apple's solution, I'd use my smart card to log in, but I wouldn't have a Kerberos environment set up. I would still have to type user ID password to get to these services. So with direct control in place, with the smart card support, I now log in with my smart card and I only have to remember my PIN that accesses the card. And at that point I get a Kerberos environment set up for me and I get single sign-on to Exchange via the Office 2008 and into my Windows file services and even web-based applications running on Windows platforms.
So I assume this is going to be really a great deal of interest not only to people using smart cards in general that have Macs, but the federal government, because part of the value add that sounds like that we have is that we've also specifically and explicitly tested this capability with the CAC and PIV card.
Right. So those government agencies, at least in the Department of Defense, they have to use CAC cards to log in, and that's a mandate. And the challenge really is just setting up an environment and being able to centrally manage it. And so we do a lot of that via group policy by centrally controlling the configuration of the Mac to make sure that it supports the trusted roots for the PKI operations to work correctly. And then outside of the Department of Defense, the HSPD 12 requires that any federal agency that does business inside the government or any contractors that do business with these federal agencies are required to use the same kind of strong authentication to log onto the systems because they've set up these networks of environments so that you can access applications cross-agency. But again, the key to making all of this work is ensuring that the trust relationships are set up correctly and that they have central ability to enforce and then go back and prove that they have these policies in place, which is something we do with our group policy infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. So maybe chalk talk it or diagram it, I should say, on the whiteboard here. What are the technical pieces that are needed and required to make this happen? I know obviously Paul and yourself did the more detailed session on the architecture, but maybe just more at a high level, talk about the pieces that you need to make this work.
Okay, so basically if we have a Macintosh, we're going to have a card reader plugged in via USB more than likely. And this is where the direct control software sits, and underneath is some of the Apple code that knows how, it's basically the drivers, if you will, and this is direct control. So that's going to handle the login of the user when he inserts his card. It has a little chip that will be on the inside of this reader. so that we can get the private key material off of the chip and then transmit back.
And Apple provides that software itself.
Right, the driver itself down here, as well as the dialog boxes for user login, you know, the change and that kind of thing. We had to do a little bit more work with respect to when I pull this card out, that's an event that we had to detect and force the screensaver to come on or log the user out of the system, depending on what your policies are set up as.
And these are group policies that we
Right.
provide.
So in an Active Directory environment, the thing is that there's a domain controller, and so this is where we need to perform the user authentication back and forth between the machine and Active Directory. So we're going to be using PKI to perform that. But how did the card get created is based on a certificate authority. And the certificate authority typically has a registration authority independent of that. So somebody, and let's just say this is the badging officer, logged on with his machine, more than likely running XP, is typically what they're going to do. And they'll have a card reader for his badge to be inserted, and he'll have another card reader set up for issuance of this card. So the trick is how do we get this card, right? So this badging officer logs on with his card inserted, puts in a blank one over here, logs on to the registration authority and submits a request to get a certificate issued for me on this card so that I can go back and take it to my Mac and log in. And what ends up happening, the registration authority sends a request to the CA. The CA is the one that signs with his private key that he holds. He'll sign that request and send it back and put it onto the card. Once he signs it, he'll publish my public certificate out here to Active Directory so that we have this link between the card and my account in Active Directory. Now I can take the card out, insert it into the reader over here, and the PKI validation will work. In fact, this link doesn't even need to exist after the issuance. But there's some other things that make this kind of tricky, and that is this card was issued, it's got a PIN associated, and basically this security officer told me what the PIN was or let me type it in on the keypad. When you first got your Visa card from the bank or opened up a checking account, you got your ATM card, the very first time, you know, they inserted the card and said, here, type in the PIN. That's exactly what's happening here. But so this card typically lasts for a year. And that's what's different about this than Kerberos, because with Kerberos environment, I log on to the Active Directory, get a Kerberos ticket back, and it's good for today, 8 hours or 10 hours. But in the smart card world, this is good for 1 year. So the next thing that we have to think about that this solution enforces is the revocation. And by that we mean that there's the need for the security officer to say, okay, David McNeely left the organization, therefore I need this card back, or I need to, even if he doesn't give it back to me, I need to terminate this card so that it's no longer usable. And the way that we do that is he'll send another request to the registration authority to terminate the card, and then over here in the certificate authority, it puts it into the revocation list, and then it publishes this. And it'll publish it back, and that's a certificate revocation list. And there's a new protocol, online certificate status protocol. Either way can do this validation. So when the user takes this card after I've been revoked, and my certificates have been published up here in the CRL that says, by the way, check this card, it's no longer good. I stick it into the reader and try to do my authentication. The Active Directory domain controller will check the CRL or do a lookup via OCSP and say, oh, that card's been revoked, and disable his access, and he'll no longer get to log in. And it's sort of hard to build a solution without addressing all of these intricacies of the issues of smart cards, because you know, we've also got to make sure that this was issued by this security officer, by that CA. But if you'll notice this sort of closed loop path over here, there's no way for somebody to generate a card that was signed by this CA unless they have an account, a proper account to do that. And so this sets up an environment where I can't go create my own card out here and stick it into the reader and try to get in. It's just not going to work because the PKI credentials are not signed by this CA.
Wow. So it sounds like the value of the AD integration from a Kerberos, but also from a group policy, provides significant value. Can you talk a little bit more about the group policies that we have specific to the smart card?
Right. So there's a couple of different policies we have. First one is enable smart card login, and I'll just abbreviate. But this one, when we check the enable smart card login, it gets put into group policy and then propagated down to the Macintosh. And we have our own group policy enforcement. Actually, I should draw that inside here as a function of direct control. That's, and we're setting up a virtual registry, basically entries. And then when we see that setting being turned on, our group policy goes out and does all the work to configure smart card login. Previously, that was about several pages worth of manual operations that had to be done on the Macintosh. Go in and edit an authorization file and add some entries. So it wasn't that easy to turn this on and make it work, which is kind of difficult. There's another thing that has to happen, and that is one of the things that happened here during the first setup of the certificate authority. He publishes CRLs, he publishes the user certs, and he also publishes his own public certificate, because this machine needs to know that he trusts that certificate authority. So one of the things we do when this machine joins Active Directory with our software is we go out and grab the trusted roots that are stored inside Active Directory and pull them down and put them into the keychain, because that enables this machine to trust this smart card and for offline login. And that's one of those things we need so that we can enable this machine to allow this user to log in if he's already logged in once before based on our cache, and then so that he can trust that card for further signing operations. And there's another policy that we set up, which is what to do on smart card removal. So with smart card removal, there's two different operations, and this is a standard Windows policy that Windows XP machines enforce. And one is when we pull this card out, that event comes back to our software, and we can either log the user out or simply turn on the screen lock. And if we turn on the screen lock, the user is going to need to insert their card in order to require that, in order to authenticate the user and get back into the system. And then there was one other setting that we've run across. Remember the Active Directory user account. So there's one setting I mentioned earlier with the Active Directory user, and that was required smart card for interactive login. Now that's a setting that's done on a per user basis. So if David McNeely has that checked, I could go to this Mac or I could go to an XP system, and I will be required to use a smart card to log into the system. We have another one that is require smart card required for machine login, and that's a little bit different because what will happen with this one is that now this particular machine is going to require smart card login. So that means if I have a smart card and you don't, and you try to log on with your user ID and password, which is valid for your account, but this machine is a sensitive machine, it's still going to require a smart card and deny you the right to log in.
So these are both computer and user policies?
Yes, they are.
Okay, wow.
So I've run across a couple of environments where they said, we've got machines in secure environments. The user is required to log on with a smart card in most cases, but it's not required, because there might be some low security systems where it doesn't matter, he can log in with his user ID password. But inside this secure environment, they want all the machines to require smart card. And this is one way to do it, so that we can ensure that we get the proper authentication on those particular sensitive systems.
Well, that's great stuff. So we offer, obviously, we have, from a licensable perspective, we have the Centrify Suite Workstation Edition, which provides the authentication and group policy driven by direct control. So this is, the smart card for the Mac is now part of...
It's part of the Smart Card Edition.
Smart Card Edition.
So basically it's an upgrade from the Workstation Edition to Smart Card Edition to add on this capability. But the really nice thing is that it's the exact same software that's installed if you install the Workstation Edition. All we simply need to do is to license the customer and to turn on the group policies back in the group policy management console.
Well, that's neat. That's great stuff. So, and I think the federal government folks are really going to like this with the integration with the CAC and PIV, but it sounds like it'll have appeal to commercial customers as well that leverage smart cards within their organization.
Right. There's actually a growing number of enterprise customers that are looking at using these common access cards. More generally speaking, those cards that would be used for photo ID purposes as well as log into their computer systems. We run across a few of the critical infrastructure type customers, the power and gas companies that use that, and some of the high-tech companies are using it as a way to secure their systems. Because the card can be used, both for online login like this, but also it can increase the security of like VPN logins. So we find a lot of companies using smart cards for just that purpose. and then later starting adding on this capability to log on to Active Directory with the smart card.
That's great. Well, and of course, you're going to cover more details in part 2 in terms of drilling down into the actual architecture itself.
Right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this side of it. In other words, how does this part work, and how do we allow login on the Unix side of things, the Macintosh side.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. And so this concludes part 1 of our Mac Smart Card support. So there's a lot of other related chalk talks. So David talked about part 2 that goes into more detail of the actual architecture itself. We have a prior chalk talk that Paul Moore and myself did on our group policy architecture. We also have a new chalk talk on our Mac desktop lockdown capabilities specific to group policy. And then David and I, a long time ago, we did another chalk talk on just our Mac capabilities. So there's probably like 3 or 4 related video chalk talks here on this topic. But definitely check out another one of those. At the very least, see part 2 and get more details on the architecture. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in another chalk talk. Bye-bye.